It should almost be there. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm sure you already read Professor Krastev's Wikipedia page, so I'm going to enter in the question. I'll start the questions immediately. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here, Professor Krastev. And as our first question, I'd like to ask you, perhaps the core concept of the book is the question why most of the anti-liberal countries in Europe used to be poster childs for democracy and liberalism. I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if the question's clear.
Yeah. This was one of the questions was how it happened that countries like Poland, Hungary, that had been praised very much, particularly in the first post-communist decade, for being the best finishing the transition to liberal democracy, why they suddenly basically voted for governments that openly declared themselves illiberal. And there was two types of explanation that have been prevailing. One was basically trying to explain it simply in economic terms and to say that the rise of these very much majoritarian, much more illiberal parties was the result of the fact that the losers of the economic reforms basically have been voted for them. This can be true in some of the cases, but it was not true in the place like Poland, where for the last 30 years, Poland is the European countries that has the best economic performance. Even social inequality has been declined. And secondly, when you see people who voted for the party in government, you're going to see that many of them does not fit the profile of the losers of the economic reform. Even more, 70% of the polls declare that they're satisfied with their personal lives. So the question for us was why people who were satisfied with their personal lives decided to vote for political parties that declared political transition as a failure. And the second explanation goes with the idea of the backsliding historical legacies of Central and Eastern Europe, saying, listen, these people went back to their authoritarian past. And I do believe also this is kind of always there is something true in any type of historical and cultural explanation, but it does not explain a lot because also the histories of these countries are very different. And then we come with two additional, in my view, and more important explanations that I'm just briefly going to present. And one is that, listen, Central and East European countries after 1989, we were very eager to be like the West, to imitate the West. And one of the major arguments of our book is that while imitation is very different than imposition, so we wanted to be like the West. But imitation, of course, creates a crisis of its own. Because if I want to be like you, it means that basically I acknowledge that you're better than me. And if I want to be like you, what about me? And what about my identity? So I do believe some of these cultural tensions have been very much present in the way the Central European societies have been functioning. And secondly, we're not simply imitating a model, but we have been imitating very much a changing model. West in the 1990s is very different than, for example, Europe in 2020. And kind of these changes and the fact that basically Central and East Europeans have been dreaming for a certain type of a Cold War West that we didn't know much about is, in my view, part of the explanation. And the second, there is a factor that has been very much underestimated in the development of Central and Eastern Europe, and this was the impact about migration, the exodus of people from the region. And I do believe this is critically important if we're going to keep in mind that in some of the countries in the region, 10 to 15% of the population have left for the last 30 years. And we're talking about the region in the world which in demographic terms is the fastest shrinking. So one of the things that basically we are claiming with Stephen Holmes in our book is that first, the fact that people are living means that there's a major change of the electoral body. When some people are saying we're the liberal voters, they're in Bologna. Secondly, what was critically important, it means also that we see a transfer of money from the east to the west that many people basically were unaware of. All the money basically invested in the education of these young people basically have been traveling with them. Thirdly, which is extremely important, this kind of a situation in which societies have been shrinking and the young people have been living created a demographic anxiety in which people do not have a feeling of collective success. Because even if you're doing personally well, are you going to be really satisfied if everybody around you is talking about leading the country? So this is what is one of our major arguments, that in a certain way, every revolution is kind of followed by a major exodus of people. But normally, this is the defeated party that is losing. This was the case of whites after the Russian Revolution. This was the case with aristocracy after the French Revolution. Paradoxically, the major problem of Central and East Europeans was that it was the winners, those who most wanted to get the change, that left first. Because why to basically, if Germany is the future of Poland, why to stay and wait for Poland become like Germany when you can go to Germany immediately? So this was part of the explanation that we provided, but I do believe it was much more subtle, developed in the book.
Perhaps, well, you already mentioned part of it, but perhaps you could expand on the concept of imitation in the book, because imitation is one of the key concepts, I believe, in the book. And perhaps you could give us more of a US perspective or an American perspective on imitation.
Listen, of course, the problem of the imitation is nothing new, and already back in the 19th century, some of the leading French sociologists were insisting the imitation is the other name for society. Basically, we imitate all the time. But the person who was, the philosopher who was of particular importance for our work in imitation was the French philosopher René Girard. And Girard is quite interesting with his idea of the imitation, because basically he's making a huge distinction between imitating Christ and imitating your peers. And the most important, his definition of imitation is the imitation of desires. In a certain way, I desire something because you desire it. And the example that normally we're giving for this is that imagine a room full of toys. And there are kids in the room, and there is a toy in the hands of one of the kids. If you're trying to see what is the kid that all other kids want, this is exactly the toy that is in the kids, in this child's hands. And I do believe this is critically important, because during the Cold War, both basically communism and the free world have been two universalist ideologies very much rooted in the European Enlightenment, and both of them has a very strong claims on the future. Both the communist countries and the United States, on the other side, believes that basically they're the model of the future to come. And what happened in 1990, and this was very well captured in Fukuyama's idea of the end of history, is that suddenly, basically, the train has reached its destination. We know who has won, and the expectation was that from now on, you're going to see more successfully or less successfully all of this society to start to imitate what is happening in the United States. And they're using Girard, we're making a point and saying, listen, the major kind of a fallacy on the Western side about the end of the Cold War were two. The first was the belief that the East is going to change, but the West is going to remain the same. But secondly, this was the fallacy to believe that imitation is a harmonious project. Strangely enough, in a certain way, it's a very contentious, and Girard himself is giving a very good literary example of this. So he's using the famous Dostoevsky's story, Eternal Husband. And the Eternal Husband is a story of a husband whose wife has died. She has passed away, and she used to have all these affairs before. So he started to visit all the former lovers, and he became particularly kind of fascinated by one of them. And he started totally to imitate him, to try to behave like him, to be him. And then this husband, this widower, decided basically and started dating a new girl. And he invited this former lover and told the stories about this. First, he wanted to show him that he has learned the tricks. But secondly, he was trying to check to what extent basically this former lover, his wife, is also going to be interested in his next wife, and to show that this time you cannot get it. And I do believe that this kind of a dialectics of the imitation, that on one level, this is I who wants to be like you, but on the other side, I want to be like you, not simply because I admire you, but because I want to replace you, because I want to defeat you. This nature of imitation was very important for us, and we have been using it very much in the book.
I just got past a question. It's a bit of a cheeky question. Well, practically, the subtitle of your book is Why is the West Losing the Fight for Democracy? So the question would be, why is the West losing the fight for democracy?
Listen, one thing that you should know about the books is that the writer either is also the author of the title or the author of the subtitle, but very rarely the author of both of them. And from this point of view, basically this type of a subtitle came only with the American edition. And the idea was to try to make it basically easier for the Americans to relate to the book. I was not going to put basically this title on the original British title. It's called Reckoning, and in a certain way, for us, it was very important, and this was part of our story, because this time we were the authors of the title. And The Light That Failed, and we're explaining this in the book in the last pages, we liked it because this is the title of Kipling's first novel. And this is a novel about losing sight. But also what we liked about the novel is the novel has two different versions. Kipling's mother, being a very serious person, told him that she wants a novel which is short enough and optimistic enough, so she insisted on happy end. So he wrote this kind of a much shorter and happy end version. But on the other side, basically he was in a melancholic mood. He was not so much about happy end. So he comes with a version which is also longer and more pessimistic. We're playing with this because this is not a book saying that, oh, we won the Cold War, but we lost the post-Cold War peace. There is part of it. But our major argument is that, for sure, the liberal hegemony that existed after the Cold War is a history for many reasons. It was contested from inside, it was contested from outside with the rise of China, but it's not necessarily a bad news, because paradoxically, in a certain way, the liberal hegemony kind of deprived liberalism of part of its pluralistic nature. So from this point of view, this is not a book about defeat. It's a much more book about how people should try to be also ready to see what you're losing when you're winning, but also what you're winning when you're losing.
I heard from one of your conferences with the other author that initially you intended to write the book about technology and also about other great powers. Well, I'm not sure if I could say great powers, but powers like Russia and China. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the role of technology in these changes. I'm not sure if it's a clear question, but...
No, it's a clear question. Listen, we didn't start the book as technology, but almost now 10 years more. 10 years ago, we decided to start this book very much about what Russia tells us about the future of the West. And one of the things that basically struck us is that many things that we were seeing in Putin's Russia, we tried to interpret that something coming from the past, from the communist legacies and so on. And we're trying to be sure that what we're seeing there has nothing to do with the West. But we were quite shocked because both Stephen and me have been working quite a lot on Russia, to see that many of the things that basically we see in Russia, starting with the idea of these imitational and arranged democracies and the high mistrust of the people to the political system and the role of disinformation and so on, was also certain trends that we can figure out in one form or the other also in the West. So when we came with this idea, of course, people said it's too much. It's slightly exaggerated. But then comes the Trump's elections and all this talk about basically Russians elected Trump, which, to be honest, we were not subscribing to. Of course, they had been interfered, but this was not the real issue. For us, then we decided that it's much more important book about how the world has changed, and here technology, but also China comes in an important way. China comes in an important way because China was never part of the age of imitation, about we talk about. Using basically the jargon of the Chinese governments, they have been always borrowing but never imitating. They were trying to get everything that basically believes that is part of the success of the West, but everything should be with the Chinese characteristics. So in a certain way, it was very much against anti-imitation, and in a certain way, this very much fits to an old anti-colonial tradition, which you can find in other places of the world. But also technology created a totally different type of interdependent world in which suddenly, even don't know with whom you're talking. One of the strange irony is that basically what is important about the Russian subversions and Russian disinformation, particularly about the United States, is that while in 1990s, basically Americans hoped that Russians are going to become like Americans. In 2016, kind of Russian intelligence agents have been pretending to be Americans and knew very well how to pretend to be Americans in order to influence the result of the American elections. So I'm saying all this because from this point of view, technology is changing the way both democracies and authoritarian regimes works. One of the interesting things, of course, that technologies are doing about the police states is that for the first time in history, you can have a police state without police informers. You don't need, like in the communist system, anybody to inform on you because you're informing on yourself all the time. Basically keeping all the information of yourself, what you're buying, where you're going, what you're reading, what you're watching. So from this point of view, technology dramatically changed the nature of the political regimes and also makes not simply imitation, but also faking a very important part of our politics.
Well, I'm not sure if you read about these things, but for example, I had read on the New Yorker that Facebook suggests Nazi groups to people who search Nazi questions, etc. So I'm not sure if this in some way, I don't know, helps the anti-liberal, illiberal causes.
For sure, because listen, liberalism was very much about people having different opinions discussing together, in which we are kind of respecting the difference of opinions. And we believe that the other side is very much interested in finding the truth in the way you're doing this. The way all this social media works, basically, they works on the idea of the addiction. They basically believes that you want the same thing that you have already ordered. And if you're going to see what is suggested to you is basically what you are doing. And this is why there was a lot of talk about these filters. For example, I don't know, is it still the case, but some years ago when I had been trying to study this, if you go from different computers and start, for example, for one mass searching, and for example, if one computer, we are basically all the time trying to find somebody who pretends that the world is flat, and on the other something totally different. So after 1 month, when you basically go on Google and you're going to basically search on the shape of the Earth, you're going to be surprised that one of the first titles that are going to come to you is that the Earth is flat. So from this point of view, there is all kind of a social media, and unfortunately, this is why we like them so much, is about confirmation bias. They're giving to us what they believe that we expect from them. And this is a huge problem because the most important about liberalism and liberal democracy, and I do believe that the real hero, if one day they're going to be a monument of a democratic citizen, at least in my view, in the monument should be a person who is ready to change his views after hearing certain arguments. But if basically this person is always going to hear only the arguments that are confirming his position, So we should not be surprised that we're ending up with a polarized societies in which we cannot find a common ground, because the worst thing that can happen, according to different citizens, is simply the other party winning the elections. So I do believe this polarization effect and the fact that the public space as a shared space between people with different views have been replaced by ghettos and silos of opinions is one of the things that explains a lot of the problems that our democracies are facing today.
Perhaps as one of the last two questions, I would like to ask you, what do you think is a concept that you felt was really important in your book, but that hasn't been asked that much or hasn't been brought to light that much?
It's not one of both for Stephen and Holmes and for me, one of the author that always has an incredibly strong influence on the way of our thinking, not only in these books, was Albert Hirschman. And his idea of exit, voice, and loyalty. And basically, the major idea is that, according to him, when people face a certain level of disappointment, be it on the market or in democracy, they react, but they react differently. So, for example, on the market, if you don't like certain good, you basically just go and try and buy something from the competitors. If I don't like Coca-Cola, I can decide and go orange juice. And by doing this, I'm sending signals to the producers of Coca-Cola that they have changed what they're doing. And when quite a lot of people are doing this, either they're going to change or they're going to die. But Hirschman said, you know what, in the world of politics, we feel a very strong loyalty to our parties, to our communities, to our states. So when we don't like something, this is not that we immediately jump or any other option, but we try to reform it. We voice our discontent. We are not simply sending a kind of anonymous signals, but we are engaged in reforming political parties, part of which we are, and trying to reform our states. And for him, this distinction between exit and voice was very strong and very clear. The logic of political behavior, the logic of behavior on the market and behavior in politics was very different. What we are seeing more in the world is that people start to behave in politics in the way they're working on the market. And this is one thing also about the exit option when we talk about Central and Eastern Europe. If you're a young man in a country like Bulgaria or Romania, and if you don't like what is going on, you have two options. You can basically stay and vote and even basically become a political candidate or even starting a party because you want your country to be governed like, for example, Germany, or you can simply decide to go to Germany. And the exit is so easier. It does not need collective actions. The chances to succeed is much higher. So I do believe this kind of a moment in which this Chinese wall between the logic of individual behavior on the field of politics and on the field of the market that Hirschman was seeing has started to disappear. But for us, this exit voice loyalty type of a thinking, which was so important for Hirschman, was in my view also very important for us.
As my last question, I was wondering if you could give us the three concepts that you think are the most, like, what you want the reader to remember. I'm not sure if, I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah, to be absolutely honest, I want readers first to remember what they like, not what they dislike in the book. But also, honestly speaking, this is one of the book which is trying to provoke people basically to go and reflect on their own experience of the last 30 years. So this is, of course, the problem and the question of imitation and basically backlash against imitation is very important for this book. We cannot have this book if there was not this kind of a general concept of imitation. But in our reading, it was a book based on a small insights. For example, one of the insights was this idea of normality, which we had been basically seeing so powerfully after 1990 in Central and Eastern Europe. And this idea of normality suddenly started to have two different meanings, because normality means the norm, but normality means also what is the most widespread behavior. So being in some of our countries, to give bribes was normal and non-normal. It was not normal because it was not the norm, which we are aspiring for. At the same time, it was a normal because most of the people were doing this. So how people are going to kind of reconcile these two different meanings of normality? And one of the ways you try to change your ways of life and said, I want to become like the norm. Or the other, you're trying to degrade the norm. You're saying, listen, they're also giving bribes in Austria or Germany, but simply they're doing it in a much more elegant way, so we don't notice it. So this type of a try to make others be like you, because you find very difficult to become like those that you try to imitate. So all these concepts, so all these small insights was basically very important for us. And if some of the people are going to be provoked by these insights, so they can better understand what they're seeing and what they have been thinking about the changing quote in the last 30 years, I do believe both Stephen and me will be very happy.
Thank you so much, Professor Krastev. And well, thank you so much and take care.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Ciao.